March 7th, 1932. 4:23 a.m. Johnny the Neck Romano's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he stumbled through the empty streets of the Bronx. Blood soaked through his shirt. Not his blood. Tommy's blood. Big Eddie's blood. The blood of 11 men who'd walked into Harlem 18 hours ago thinking they were executioners. Now Johnny was the only one left. He had one job now. Get back to Dutch Schultz. Deliver the message. The message that Bumpy Johnson had burned into his memory before letting him walk out of Harlem alive. Johnny reached the Bronx Social Club at dawn. Dutch's headquarters. The place where this nightmare had started yesterday morning when Dutch had looked at 12 of his best men and said 7 words that signed their death warrants. I want Bumpy Johnson dead by midnight. Johnny pushed through the door. Dutch was still awake, sitting at his usual table, drinking whiskey, playing solitaire. He looked up when Johnny walked in. Alone. Dutch's eyes narrowed. Where are the others? Johnny's voice cracked. Gone. All of them. Dead. Dutch stood up slowly. All 11? How? It wasn't a fight. Dutch. It was. Johnny struggled to find the words. It was like Harlem knew we were coming before we even crossed 110th Street. Dutch slammed his glass down. What the hell are you talking about? Johnny took a shaking breath. Bumpy Johnson sent me back with a message. What message? Johnny's voice dropped to barely a whisper, repeating the exact words Bumpy had said to him 6 hours ago. Tell Dutch Schultz that Harlem is not the Bronx. Tell him we don't play by mob rules here. Tell him his 12 men came for one, and now there's only one left to tell the story. And tell him if he ever sends anyone into my neighborhood again, I won't send a messenger back. I'll send a casket. The room went silent. What nobody knew, what the newspapers would never print, is that Bumpy Johnson had known about Dutch Schultz's hit squad for 72 hours before they even crossed into Harlem. And what Bumpy did in those 72 hours didn't just save his life. It rewrote the rules of organized crime in New York forever. To understand what happened that night in Harlem, you need to understand who Dutch Schultz was in 1932. Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, was one of the most violent mobsters in New York. By 1932, he controlled bootlegging operations across the Bronx, owned speakeasies in Manhattan, had half the cops in New York on his payroll. But there was one thing Dutch didn't control: Harlem's numbers racket. The numbers game was simple. Poor folks bet nickels and dimes on 3-digit numbers drawn daily. Individually, it was small money. But across a neighborhood like Harlem, thousands of people betting daily, it added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. And in 1932, that operation belonged to Madame Stephanie Street Claire, the Queen of Harlem. And her enforcer, her strategist, her right hand, was a man named Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't like other gangsters. He was only 25 years old, but he'd already built a reputation that made grown men nervous. He didn't rule through fear alone. He ruled through intelligence, through loyalty, through an understanding of Harlem that outsiders could never comprehend. Dutch Schultz didn't care about any of that. To Dutch, Harlem was just another neighborhood to conquer, another revenue stream to control. And Bumpy Johnson was just another street thug standing in his way. March 4th, 1932. 3 days before the massacre. Dutch called a meeting at his Bronx headquarters. 12 men showed up. His best. Experienced killers who'd worked for Dutch for years. Tommy, the Hammer, Malone. 6 hits under his belt. Never missed. Big Eddie Kravitz. 6'5", 280 pounds of muscle and meanness. Johnny the Neck Romano. Dutch's driver. Loyal to a fault. And 9 others. Shooters. Enforcers. Men who'd killed for Dutch in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens. Dutch looked at them across the table, his eyes cold and flat. Harlem's been a problem for too long, Dutch said, lighting a cigar. Madame Street Claire thinks she runs that neighborhood. Her boy, Bumpy Johnson, thinks he's untouchable. They're wrong. So what do you want us to do? Tommy asked. I want you to walk into Harlem tomorrow night. I want you to find Bumpy Johnson. And I want you to put 2 bullets in his head. Then, I want you to hit his spots, his people, his operations. By midnight tomorrow, I want Bumpy Johnson dead and Harlem scared. Big Eddie grinned. 12 of us against 1 man? That's overkill, Dutch. Dutch leaned forward. I don't want a fair fight. I want a message. I want everyone in Harlem to know what happens when you stand between Dutch Schultz and money. Overkill is the point. Johnny Romano felt uneasy. Something about this didn't sit right. Harlem wasn't like the other neighborhoods they'd hit. Harlem had boundaries, rules, a code that even the Italian mob respected. But Johnny didn't say anything. You didn't question Dutch Schultz. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. When do we move? Tommy asked. Tomorrow night, March 6th. Bumpy usually hits a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue around 10 p.m. You go in, you do the job, you disappear. By the time Harlem realizes what happened, you'll be back in the Bronx counting your money. Dutch slid an envelope across the table. $5,000. Split 12 ways when the job's done. The men nodded. 5,000 was good money. Easy money for a simple hit. What they didn't know was that before they'd even left that meeting, Bumpy Johnson already knew they were coming. March 4th, 1932. 11:37 p.m. Same night as Dutch's meeting. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of Madame Street, Claire's townhouse, on 139th Street. With him was Illinois Gordon, his most trusted associate, and Madame herself. A man named Marcus, one of Bumpy's street runners, stood nervously by the door. Tell them what you told me, Bumpy said quietly. Marcus cleared his throat. I was doing a pickup in the Bronx this afternoon. Numbers collection from one of our spots near 149th. While I was there, I saw Dutch Schultz's boys gathering at his club. 12 of them. Heavy crew. Tommy Malone, Big Eddie, the whole lineup. And? Madame Street Claire asked, her voice sharp. I got friendly with the bartender. Slipped him $20. He told me Dutch called a special meeting. Said he heard Dutch say your name, Mr. Johnson. Said he heard the word hit. The room went silent. Illinois Gordon cursed under his breath. Dutch is sending 12 men to Harlem? That's what I'm hearing, Marcus said. Bumpy sat back in his chair, thinking. This wasn't unexpected. Dutch had been circling Harlem for months, testing boundaries, trying to muscle in on the numbers. Bumpy had pushed back every time, and now Dutch was escalating. Madam Street. Claire looked at Bumpy. What do you want to do? Most men in Bumpy's position would have done one of two things. Run, or prepare for war. Hide until the threat passed. Or gather an army and meet Dutch's crew head-on in a bloody street battle. Bumpy Johnson did neither. How much time do we have? Bumpy asked. They're moving tomorrow night, Marcus said. March 6th. Bumpy nodded slowly. 2 days. That's enough. Enough for what? Illinois asked. Bumpy looked at him. Enough to make sure they never leave Harlem, and enough to send Dutch Schultz a message he'll never forget. Over the next 48 hours, Bumpy Johnson orchestrated something that had never been done before in New York's underworld. He didn't gather an army. He didn't prepare for a shootout. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He turned Harlem itself into a trap. Bumpy called in every favor he had. Every numbers runner, every speakeasy owner, every barber, every shopkeeper, every street kid who worked for him. He spread the word through the neighborhood like wildfire. 12 white men are coming into Harlem tomorrow night. They're here to kill me. And if they succeed, Dutch Schultz takes over the numbers. Your numbers. Your neighborhood. Your money. The response was immediate. Harlem closed ranks. Shopkeepers agreed to close early. Bartenders agreed to stay alert. Street kids agreed to watch corners. And Bumpy's enforcers, 20 of them, positioned themselves at key locations throughout the neighborhood. But here's the genius of Bumpy's plan. He didn't tell his people to start shooting. He told them to watch, to wait, to isolate. When they come, let them in, Bumpy said. Let them walk our streets. Let them feel like they're in control. And then, one by one, we make them disappear. No witnesses. No noise. No mess. By morning, it'll be like they were never here. Illinois Gordon stared at Bumpy. You want to make 12 men vanish? Not 12. Bumpy corrected. 11. We let one walk out. We need someone to deliver the message. March 6th, 1932. 9:47 p.m. Dutch Schultz's 12-man crew crossed into Harlem at 110th Street. They came in 3 cars. 4 men per vehicle. Tommy Malone led the first car. Big Eddie the second. Johnny Romano drove the third. The streets were unusually quiet. Too quiet. Where is everybody? Big Eddie muttered, looking out the window. It's Monday night, Tommy said. People are home. But that wasn't true. Harlem, on a Monday night, was usually alive with activity. Speakeasies, jazz clubs, people on stoops, kids playing stickball under streetlights. Tonight, the streets were empty. Johnny Romano felt that unease again. Something was wrong. But they were already here. Already committed. The plan was simple. Find Bumpy Johnson. Kill him. Hid his operations. Get out. They knew Bumpy frequented a speakeasy on Lenox Avenue called the Rhythm Club. That's where they headed first. 10:03 p.m. The 3 cars pulled up outside the Rhythm Club. Tommy, Big Eddie, and 4 others went inside. 6 men stayed with the cars, including Johnny. Inside, the club was nearly empty. A bartender wiped down glasses. A piano player in the corner played a slow tune. 3 customers sat at separate tables. Nursing drinks. No Bumpy Johnson. Tommy walked up to the bartender. "Where's Bumpy?" The bartender didn't even look up. "Don't know anyone by that name." Big Eddie grabbed the bartender by the collar. "Wrong answer. Where is Bumpy?" The bartender's face stayed calm. "Ain't seen him tonight." Tommy pulled his gun, pressed it against the bartender's temple. "Last chance." "I said I don't know." Tommy pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. Tommy looked at his gun, confused. He'd loaded it himself that morning. He pulled the trigger again. Click. Before Tommy could process what was happening, the 3 customers at the table stood up. They weren't customers. They were Bumpy's men. And they were armed. The piano player stopped playing. The door behind the bar opened, and 8 more men walked out. Big Eddie reached for his gun. Too slow. The last thing Tommy Malone saw was a flash of movement before everything went black. Outside, Johnny Romano heard nothing. No gunshots. No shouting. Just silence. That should have been the first warning. 10:17 p.m. Tommy's crew had been inside for 14 minutes. Too long. One of the men with Johnny, a guy named Paulie, shifted nervously. "Something ain't right." "Give them 5 more minutes," Johnny said. At 10:22 p.m., the door to the rhythm club opened. But it wasn't Tommy who walked out. It was a young black kid. Couldn't have been more than 15 years old. He walked straight up to Johnny's car window and knocked. Johnny rolled down the window. "Yeah?" The kid's voice was calm, almost friendly. "You boys looking for Bumpy?" "Who's asking?" "He's asking. Says if you want to find him, he's at Small's Paradise, 135th and 7th Avenue. The kid turned and walked away, disappearing into an alley. Paulie looked at Johnny. "That's a setup." "Of course it's a setup," Johnny said. "But what choice do we have? Tommy and the others are in there." They waited another 10 minutes. No one came out of the rhythm club. Finally, Johnny made a decision. "We go to Small's Paradise. If it's a trap, we spring it. We got 6 men and enough firepower to fight our way out." They drove to 135th and 7th Avenue. Small's Paradise was one of the biggest jazz clubs in Harlem. 3 floors, packed every night with dancers, drinkers, music lovers. Tonight, the front door was wide open. Music drifted out into the street. But no doorman. No bouncer. No crowd waiting to get in. "Definitely a trap," Paulie said. Johnny pulled his gun. "We go in together. Stay close. Watch every corner." The 6 men walked into Small's Paradise. The club was full. Hundreds of people dancing, drinking, laughing. The band played hot jazz. Everything looked normal. Except every single person in that club was black. And every single one of them turned to look at the 6 white men who'd just walked in. The music stopped. Johnny's heart was pounding. This was wrong. All wrong. And then, from the back of the room, a figure stood up from a corner table. Bumpy Johnson. He was younger than Johnny expected. Couldn't have been more than 25. But the way he moved, the way every eye in that room followed him, Johnny understood immediately. This man was dangerous. Bumpy walked through the crowd. People parted for him like he was royalty. He stopped 10 feet from Johnny and his crew. "You boys lost?" Bumpy asked, his voice calm, almost amused. Johnny's gun was in his hand, but so were the guns of 50 other people in that room. They were surrounded. "Where's Tommy Malone?" Johnny demanded, trying to sound tough. "Where's my crew?" Bumpy tilted his head. "Your crew made a mistake. They came into my neighborhood thinking they could take what's mine. Thinking Harlem would just roll over because Dutch Schultz sent 12 tough guys." "Where are they?" Johnny repeated. Bumpy's expression didn't change. "They're gone. All 6 of them." Paulie raised his gun. "You're lying." Bumpy looked at Paulie like he was a child having a tantrum. "Put the gun down before you embarrass yourself." "Or what?" Paulie snarled. Bumpy didn't answer. He just nodded slightly. From every corner of the room, guns appeared. Not just a few. Dozens. Bartenders. Waiters. Musicians. Dancers. Everyone was armed. Johnny grabbed Paulie's arm and forced it down. "Lower the gun." Paulie hesitated, then obeyed. Bumpy turned his attention back to Johnny. "What's your name?" "Johnny Romano." "Well, Johnny Romano, I'm going to do something for you that I didn't do for your friends. I'm going to let you leave Harlem alive." Johnny's throat was dry. "Why?" "Because someone needs to deliver a message to Dutch Schultz. And you look like a man who'll remember every word I'm about to say." Bumpy stepped closer. The room was so silent Johnny could hear his own heartbeat. "Tell Dutch Schultz that Harlem is not the Bronx. Tell him we don't play by mob rules here. Tell him his 12 men came for one, and now there's only one left to tell the story." Bumpy's voice dropped lower, colder. "And tell him if he ever sends anyone into my neighborhood again, I won't send a messenger back. I'll send a casket." Johnny nodded, unable to speak. Bumpy turned to his people. "Let them go." The crowd parted again. A path to the door. Johnny and his 5 remaining men backed toward the exit, guns still drawn but useless. They reached the door. Outside, their cars were still there, untouched. Johnny turned back one last time. Bumpy Johnson stood in the center of that club, surrounded by his people, looking like exactly what he was. The King of Harlem. Johnny and his crew got in the cars and drove. Fast. They made it 3 blocks before Johnny realized something. There were only 2 cars. They'd come in 3 vehicles. 12 men. Now there were 6 men. 2 cars. Johnny looked in his rearview mirror. Paulie and 2 others were in the car behind him. That was 5. He looked at his passenger seat. Empty. He'd had a guy with him. Vinny. Vinny had been sitting right there when they'd walked into Small's paradise. Now Vinny was gone. Johnny's blood ran cold. They kept driving. Made it another 5 blocks. At the intersection of 125th and Lenox, Paulie's car wasn't behind them anymore. Johnny slammed the brakes, looked back. The street was empty. 2 cars had become 1. 12 men had become 2. Just Johnny and the guy in the back seat? a young enforcer named Sal. "Where did everyone go?" Sal whispered, his voice shaking. Johnny didn't answer. He just drove faster, desperate to get out of Harlem, to cross 110th Street, to reach the Bronx. At 110th Street, Johnny looked in his rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Sal was gone. Johnny was alone. He didn't stop driving until he reached Dutch Schultz's club in the Bronx. 4:23 a.m. And that's when our story began. Dutch Schultz didn't believe Johnny at first. 11 men don't just disappear, Dutch said, pacing his office. They did, Johnny insisted. It was like Harlem swallowed them whole. No shots fired. No fights. They just vanished. Dutch sent men back to Harlem the next morning. Daylight. Looking for bodies, for evidence, for anything. They found nothing. No bodies in alleys. No blood in the streets. No witnesses. Nothing. It was like Dutch's crew had never existed. The only proof they'd been there at all was Johnny Romano, sitting in Dutch's office, broken and terrified, repeating Bumpy Johnson's message over and over. Harlem is not the Bronx. We don't play by mob rules here. Dutch was furious, humiliated. He'd sent 12 of his best men, and Harlem had erased them without a trace. Dutch wanted revenge. He wanted to gather an army, to march into Harlem, to burn it to the ground. But his advisors, smarter men, told him the truth. "You can't win a war in Harlem," one of them said. "You don't know the streets. You don't know the people. And Bumpy Johnson, he's not just another gangster. He's part of that neighborhood. If you go to war with him, you're going to war with all of Harlem." Dutch didn't listen at first. But over the next few weeks, reality sank in. Other mobsters heard what happened. The story spread through New York's underworld. Dutch Schultz sent 12 men to kill Bumpy Johnson. Only one came back. It made Dutch look weak, desperate, foolish. And in the world of organized crime, looking weak is the most dangerous thing you can do. Dutch Schultz never moved on Harlem again. Not because he respected Bumpy Johnson, because he was afraid of him. In 1935, 3 years after the failed hit, Dutch Schultz was murdered. Shot in a Newark chop house on orders from the Commission, the governing body of the Mafia. The official reason was that Dutch had become too erratic, too dangerous, too much of a liability. But people who knew the truth understood. Dutch had lost his edge. He'd lost his reputation. And it started that night in March 1932 when he sent 12 men into Harlem and only got one back. Bumpy Johnson, on the other hand, lived another 36 years. He became a legend, not because of how many men he killed, because of how many wars he avoided. That night in March 1932, Bumpy could have met Dutch's crew with violence, could have turned Lenox Avenue into a war zone. Instead, he did something smarter. He made 11 men disappear without a single gunshot echoing through Harlem. He sent one man back with a message that ended the conflict before it began. That's power. Not the power to destroy. The power to control the narrative. To win without fighting. To make your enemy too afraid to try again. The numbers racket in Harlem stayed in Bumpy's hands. Madam Street. Claire eventually retired, and Bumpy took over completely. For the next 3 decades, he was the undisputed king of Harlem. And every mobster in New York knew why. Because the night Dutch Schultz sent 12 men to kill him, Bumpy Johnson proved something that the Mafia had never wanted to admit. Harlem was different. It had its own rules, its own power, its own protector. And that protector was Bumpy Johnson. Look, here's the thing most people miss about this story. It's not about violence. It's about intelligence. Bumpy Johnson was 25 years old when this happened. Most 25-year-olds in his position would have panicked, would have run, would have met violence with more violence. Bumpy did the opposite. He used the 72 hours he had to turn his neighborhood into a weapon. He didn't need an army. He had Harlem. And Harlem was more loyal to him than any crew Dutch Schultz could assemble. The most dangerous weapon in organized crime isn't a gun. It's loyalty. It's knowing your territory so well that you can make your enemies disappear without firing a shot. Dutch Schultz learned that lesson too late. And Johnny Romano, the only man who walked out of Harlem that night, he carried that message for the rest of his life. He never worked for Dutch again. He left New York entirely, moved to Philadelphia, became a bartender, lived quietly. People say Johnny never stopped looking over his shoulder, never stopped hearing Bumpy Johnson's voice in his head. Tell Dutch Schultz that Harlem is not the Bronx. If this story got you thinking about power, loyalty, and what real control looks like, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. And if you're not subscribed to Bumpy Johnson, the Harlem Godfather yet, what are you waiting for? We're dropping stories like this every single day, and trust me, the next one is going to blow your mind. Drop a comment and tell me, could Dutch Schultz have won if he'd done things differently? Or was Bumpy Johnson always 3 steps ahead? And hey, turn on those notifications because next week, we're telling the story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into Lucky Luciano's office unarmed and walked out with the deal of the century. You don't want to miss that. Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given. It was earned. And Bumpy Johnson earned every ounce of his. This is Bumpy Johnson, the Harlem Godfather. And we're just getting started.